Hi, my name is Benedict. There have been fewer videos lately, largely because there's not a lot of gain for me. I'm doing this largely because I want to. I would love to see this being presented by people when there are the inevitable questions about how do I learn to synthesize, because this is going to be a pair of videos about how to actually learn to be a synthesist, how to be able to make specific kinds of sounds. A lot of people struggle with this, and while I get it, I also don't. Obviously, synthesis came reasonably easy for me. Anybody who says, oh, it's easy, is probably fibbing to you. There is a tremendous amount to learn, but the thing is, you learn it over a period of time by doing, and a lot of people don't actually do it. So yes, the problems that people have are fear-based, which leads them to go, oh, well, there's too much to learn, so I can't do it, so I won't, which is, of course, self-defeating. And most people don't want to learn the basics. Some people have got this real strange idea that it's demeaning to learn basics. So we've got to bypass this idea that learning is bad, or that learning in any way demeans us. If we don't know how to do a thing, how are we going to transition? So people skip the core learning and they go straight to the, I want to make the advanced sounds. And of course, that is coupled to the fact that people just plain don't practice. The first thing I will ask for is your support. Obviously, hiring me to help you realize your project is the number one thing that I hope for. One way that you can commit is to pop over to my Ko-fi account and either just pay me something, buy me a virtual cup of coffee or four, or invest in a toy. So something like tape deco that we will hear here doing a little bit of light echo reverb type duties just to make the sound a little softer to listen to. Righty, the beginning. As we begin, I'll move as quickly as I can. We are going to focus on core basics, which is going to get you where you want to go faster when you do it right. The first thing we'll cover, obviously, are in most synthesizers, you will find some core basic waveforms. The most common being a sine, which has a fundamental and no overtones. So it's a pure sound. We can consider that being like a flute. Now I'm going to talk about real instruments merely just as an avatar for a style of sound or style of how an instrument moves. I'm not interested in synthesizing or emulating those things. Yes, I will make sounds that sound very fluty, but it's always to create a unique instrument. Let's not go down the path of going, but that doesn't sound like a flute. Of course it doesn't. It sounds like a synthesizer, and so it bloody well should. Otherwise, you should not be playing with synthesizers. You should be getting a fluterer on your piece. So we've got our sine wave, which has no overtones. No harmonics, so it's a very simple, clean, clear, pure sound. Boring. We then have a triangle wave, which is somewhere about there. As you see, we've got some overtones. See how we've got our fundamental here, and then we've got some more little pointy bits. There are some more overtones. It's got a hollow, tubey sort of sound to it. Next, in terms of complexity, is the square. You hear now it's getting quite nasal, it's getting hard, but at the same time it's got this really tubey quality to it. We look at our overtone series. Our fundamental, we've got a big gap. Overtone, big gap, overtone, what have you. It gets harder to see the higher we go because as we get closer to each other. The more perfect that square is, the more we have those gaps. And then the next main form is the sawtooth. See how we've now filled that gap. So what we should take away from this is that it's all just about the tone which is derived from our harmonic series, all our overtones. That's all you need to accept about it. You don't need to know it in any complex detail for now, having a little bit more complex detail later, but you should start to work that out as you go. If you are doing actual practice, where you're just sitting there going, oh, okay, and correlating things, then you will get to a point where you go, oh, now I get that. There are basic forms. The next basic form is noise. So that is everything all the time. And white noise is some kind of all frequencies, random, all the time. And we can change quality of noise in various ways. I'm not going to get into noise. I did made a whole video, an hour or so, talking about different types of noise and how to use them for higher hertz. So if you want to dig into noise, it's an amazing subject. Do so over there. The other form is wavetable. Here's what a wavetable is. It is a table of waves. So it's like these basic waves that you have been shown here, and this is a wavetable already, and it's the ability to morph through them, exactly what you saw here. But they tend to have more complex waves. Here is one we prepared earlier, and it moves from an oscillator shaped like this to an oscillator shaped like this. And it's that ability to morph from one shape to another or through many shapes. So some wavetables that are built into here do this. But there is no more complexity to them than the very basic understanding that we have these basic forms and we can morph from one to another. There are quite a few different ways to build wavetables, but ultimately it's all exactly the same. We've got a wave shape, we've got another wave shape, and we transition between them somehow. Don't start with wavetables as being the more advanced, therefore you're going to use them. You'll miss your basics. You've got to have your basics or you will struggle later. There are different forms of synthesis, additive, subtractive, what have you. I'm not going to get into them. I have made very detailed overviews of things like FM. Made a great video for higher hertz on algorithm, which is a wonderful FM synth, and ran through all of that. Don't think that learning that is going to make you a better synthesist. Learning how it works is great, but start with your basics, which is your 4 or 5 basic waveforms and noise. Once you understand how they work and why they work, then you will do much better. The trick in why they work is see how the shape, the smoother it is, the smoother the sound. As soon as you get hard edges, the sound develops more overtones, it becomes brighter, richer. That's it. That's how oscillators work. The oscillator creates the core tone out of which you create your overall sound. Now the next thing that we have is a filter. A filter simply cuts bits out of your sound. So you can see here and here how we're rolling off the top end. As in, we have filtered this out. This is why this form is referred to as subtractive. But every synthesizer now is a complex model. Like this is actually an additive synthesizer at heart. And of course this filter doesn't exist because it's digital. We've got another form of filter here, which effectively sounds the same. It's merely changing the wave shape. That's just pure digital synthesis. So that's the difference between digital and analog. This emulates more of an analog type feel than that. Same. Don't care. So we've got our filters. Yep. There's a low pass that can have a slope value, so it can be a relatively gentle slope or a steeper slope. The steeper slope will just tend to have a meatier feel, but neither is more right than the other. You can achieve the same results largely with the other kind. So there's no right, there's no wrong, there's no better. High pass does the complete opposite of low pass. It rolls off and chops off parts. They are quite useful for more than just making things sound unpleasant. Be cautious about using these too much because while there are instances where removing the fundamental from a sound, remember the bit on the bottom here, there are reasons to do that, but notice how at the same time it makes the sound uncomfortable. So there are purposes to do that, but please be careful. If you're wanting people to feel uncomfortable, by all means do that, but if you are just driven to do it, it's a bad call. If you're trying to think, oh, well, that makes the sound cooler, just be careful about what you're doing, because you can make your sounds sound like they're unconnected, unmoored, and that's not a particularly great thing to do. Next form is what's called a band pass. So as you see, we let a band, as in the bit in the middle, come through, and we roll off the ups and the downs, and we just get the pointy bit in the middle. And we can obviously change how pointy the bit in the middle is. Quite simply, that's all you need to know about them. There is also a notch filter, which is the complete opposite. See how we can cut a bit out of the signal, and we can define how wide that is. That's it. You're not going to use notches as often, but just be aware they're there. They're your basic shapes. You'll see more complex shapes, but this is what you need. And honestly, the most important of the lot is your low-pass filter. So get comfortable using it. Spend a lot of time using that. The other thing to be aware of is what's called key follow. See how that kind of gets quieter and less bright? That filter is working what we might call globally, as though we've put a filter after the whole instrument. Good for bass type sounds where you want the lower end of the keyboard to be more dominant than the top. But if you want it to be the other way around, let's say a violin, we want the top of the keyboard to be a little bit brighter and more dominant. So what this does is it tracks. And you can see that quite well here, just as a visual. See, as we go up the keyboard, the filter opens. If we turn that back, the filter closes, and you can see our sound becomes duller. This still has a lot of overtones. This has very few overtones. Open it up, it's got the same amount of overtones as here, which means that this effectively becomes duller, but it's exactly the same as our pivot key, which is on most modern synths middle C, but occasionally finds a few that have their pivot key at C1 or even at MIDI note 0, which is an octave or so below C1, which I don't love, but it has a logic of its own. It's nicer to pivot at middle C. So that's your key follow. There are good reasons to need to know about that, because otherwise you'll make a sound and you go, it doesn't feel right across the whole keyboard. That has a big impact on how you rightify it across the keyboard. So between our basic tone and our tone modifier, we create our synthesizer sound. That's our basic sort of sound. And again, if you don't put the time into having this make sense, most people just gloss straight across that, going, it's boring, it's irrelevant, I don't need to know that. Because they don't know it and they don't want to know it, and then they have problems as they try to do more complex things, more evocative things, because they've missed the basics. So really spend time just correlating what happens. Obviously, if we've got a sine wave, the filter does virtually nothing because it's got nothing to filter, whereas if we've got an aggressive tone, we've got plenty to filter. There is a lot to be said for spending a lot of time playing just with a sawtooth and a low-pass filter. Just that alone, working out, okay, how do I get different tones? How do I get different timbres? If I go low enough, I get, well, it's not really a sine wave because we've got a couple of overtones, but it's not a full triangle wave either, so we've got something we can loosely refer to as a sine wave. Open it up, and we just get a form that's brighter and brighter. Okay, it doesn't become a square unless we change it to, but I spend a lot of time understanding how you get this change. It's got to settle in and have you go, oh, I get this now, rather than going, I'm so super, I don't need to do that because I'm too smart for that, because you'll come unglued later when you're missing your fundamentals. So that's our filters. The next important thing is the envelope. So everything has to have a shape. Without a shape, it doesn't move. So as we hear, go, that's not very exciting. It's not doing anything. It was more exciting when I was doing this. We're getting some shape or movement from the notes I'm very intelligently playing, and the fact that if I'm reasonably intelligently modulating the timbre along with what's being played, then it makes that sound start to become something. Obviously that could be done with a foot pedal or a modulation wheel, which we'll come to later. But we do a lot of movement with envelopes. So we will look at an ADSR, which stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. So attack is how long it takes for the sound to go from fully silent to fully loud. Decay is the time that it goes from fully loud to fall back again. And what it falls back to is the sustain level. So here with sustain at nothing, we get a blippy sort of sound. As we raise the sustain, you see that there's still a volume left. And at this point, the decay has no impact whatsoever because it's hitting fully loud and staying fully loud. Now there are sounds that will take advantage of using a little bit of fall, and that has more punch than this, even though this is louder, and you're going to think, oh, that's louder, it's better. You've got to get over the louder, it's better. But it doesn't have punch, it just sort of turns on and it's flubs. There's no punch. Whereas that has punch, because we hear it get fully loud and drop back a little bit. And you know what that sounds like? Compression. And then the next one is release. So the more time it takes for that sound to go to from fully loud to fully quiet, all of this defines what kind of sound we seem to have. And small moves can have a big perceived effect here, so you need to spend time working at how do I get the feel that I want. And there is no one set feel that is right. Every piece will require movement, often within the piece, within the way the sound performs. So that's either moving things in real time, again, which we'll talk about later, or simply automating, so that in the verse we might be slow and in the chorus we might be fast. So that's your envelope here being applied to the volume of the sound, the level of the sound. I use the words sort of interchangeably, but also sort of differently. Again, over in higher hertz, there's a whole video on levels and talking about volume versus level. Volume is the human perception of sound. It's emotional, therefore far from factual, and level is a measurable thing. It's X. So we've now got a shape. The basic shapes that we can consider that we're likely to have, and again I use these terms broadly and loosely, is that we might have what we'll call an organ shape. That's where the sound turns on as the key goes down and it turns off as the key comes off. It's just literally a square. Useful. There's then what I'll call a bell shape. People call these plucks, and they sort of are, but it's a weird term. Because plucks often are far more complex in terms of how you're plucking a guitar or violin string or whatever. But nonetheless, a bell shape simply means that you hit the dang thing and it rings until it quits ringing. Obviously, if we match our timbre to our shape, then we end up with something that we are finding more believable, or it changes the perceived instrument. Because that's vaguely guitar-like. If we close our filter, it becomes vaguely piano-like. But more marimba-like, or something like that. The next shape is the piano. Piano is a little bit of a complex one because it has a pedal which allows us to keep the sound alive. A bell has no real control unless we put our hand on it, called choking, like you see with drummers in metal bands, particularly in glam metal. Hit the cymbal, grab it, psh, 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 rather than psh, choking. So a piano naturally keeps playing as long as we have the key down, but lets go as soon as we let go. So to exaggerate, plays forever, stops. That's a piano shape. But then a piano has this sustain pedal that when we push that down, it actually turns the release so that all the notes keep ringing out. And that's an important part of getting a credible piano-like performance. Then we've got what I'll call an oboe, which isn't instant because you've got to blow the thing. It's actually quite complex. It will tend to fall a little bit because we will run out of breath. Obviously, the better you are as a player, the more you can control your breath over time, but I don't think oboe players use circular breathing like didgeridoos. It will also have a pretty instant release. So we've got a credible sort of woodwindy kind of sound. That's all we're looking for, the basic form. And then we've got strings. So if we think of a string section where we're playing Mozart and it's all very syrupy and lovely, we've got a more complex, evolving sort of a shape. Then, of course, we've got a tone that doesn't move. We're creating movement in the levels over time, but we're not creating movement in the tone over time, in which case we bring in another envelope. And this time, rather than using an ADSR, which is fairly set, we're going to use what's called an MSEG, Multi-Segment Envelope Generator, MSEG. They're initially a bit confusing, but once you get used to them, here's one that's been set up to look like an ADSR. So we've got our attack time, our decay to our sustain point, and then our release. We're going to apply that across our filter. So now we've got a combination of these two working together. See, that creates one result. That creates another result. They're very similar, but if you can't tell the difference and know when it's appropriate to have one more than the other, then you'll struggle. Music's all about subtlety, and you've got to do the subtlety thing. So we've got the attack time, instant, not quite instant, slow, decay time, our sustain level, and then the release. These are exactly the same as them, but they're just malleable. Not to mention the fact that we can put other points in the middle, which is interesting. Sometimes really powerful, sometimes really annoying. Then also with most MSEGs you can create a curve. So you see how I've put a curve in here. That changes, yes thank you, how we perceive that, because we've changed how it moves over time, as in it stays low and then whoop, reaches up suddenly, or reaches up quite quickly and then slows down. And that has a big impact on how we perceive things. Many modern digital synths, these are what's called linear, which means they look like this. They're just a straight line from here to there. And some actually already have a curve built in. Generally speaking, these sorts of curves or these sorts of curves sound nice and natural, but I am a big fan of linear. Now, I think these are linear, and the MSEGs allow us to change what we're hearing. How they work together obviously is a big factor. If we create a pluck or bass type shape for our filter, we obviously hear that with a fast envelope attack time for our amp. But if we make this longer, we no longer hear it that way. It's become more of a bowed sound. So our bass or plucky type sound has now become a violin sound, a bowed sound. So how your two envelopes work together is really important. In a certain sense, it's a little trickier when you've got what you see here, which is an MSEG over there and an ADSR there. If you have an amp and a filter envelope kind of on top of each other, it's a little easier to see, but synthesis is about learning to see these things inside yourself. It's like you've got to be able to see and feel it inside. You've got to be able to look at this and go, okay, I see this, I see this. I know roughly what that sound's going to sound like. And that's just experience. That comes from practice, from actually spending your time to play with it. And when people don't put in that time, it becomes really self-evident. So it's really important to spend the time practicing to work out how to bring these elements together. So as you hear, we're now getting quite a different sound. In the next video, we're going to spend a lot of time going through different types of sounds, how to create the forms. And then the last main element is the LFO. So it's a low frequency oscillator. So essentially it's another oscillator, just like this one. Rather than vibrating at audio speed, it's vibrating slowly. So different synthesizers set these up differently. In this case, we're going to use a matrix to route it to the pitch of oscillator 1. Let's keep this one open. So LFO 1 here. Again, there are lots of different shapes or waveforms. And we can assign it to lots of things, but to start with, just assign to pitch. While it's a lot of fun to assign them to things like filters, and you feel very like, oh, how synthesizer-y am I? And that's cool, play around with that. But for now, spend a lot of time applying it to pitch, because a number of people who I'm mixing or working on a piece of their work, and their sound is like a dead duck. It turns on and then becomes a dead duck in the mix. See how this starts quite nicely, but then once it's held, it just becomes pointless. It disappears. Whereas as soon as we add some vibrato, the sound becomes a lot richer, and we're only running one oscillator here. But this is now an evocative sound. This is a nice sound. I'd use this sound. So we've got our LFO with different shapes. The sine wave's the most common. If you're going, it's a little intense, then swap to a triangle wave. It's just a little more subtle. And it works nicely for certain things where you want it to be a more even flow. Whereas this, it stays high, and then it moves to low and stays low. And so it just changes the form, the shape. There's also... And this is a tricky one to use, because obviously it's not very natural. But it's surprisingly effective in small amounts. That can be really nice. And again, once we get that up faster, pull it back a little bit. We just get a different feel from this. Generally, you're not going to use this as much in terms of a musical instrument, but you will commonly hear this on. Where we've put a huge emphasis on our roll-off for our filter. And it's a really simple trick, but it works really nicely. If we go back to this, that's how you get all those cool science fiction-y effects. And that gives a really beautiful feel that's not a specific instrument. Now we can apply, depending upon your instrument, things in a positive direction or a negative direction. So if we slow this guy down, let's put this back to the pitch. See how that's descending? If we now swap it to the other way, that's the shape that we've got here. If we flip it around, it's going backwards. Depends on your synthesizers as to whether it'll do that. Those that have really only sort of preset amounts will tend to only work one way. In this case, they've given us the ability to flip them in another way. Then you've just got more complex shapes, which are depending upon the synth. Some won't even have these more complex shapes or stepped shapes. Not the first thing you'd want to be using, but they can be very effective. Not so much on pitch, but where there's a will, there's a way. They're unnatural, and then you've got a soft noise. You can think of the random LFO, the sample and hold, as being a hard-edged noise. And this is a soft noise. So it wanders rather than dotting around. And that can be really effective. There are different ways in which an LFO works, so it's pretty important to understand how they work. Firstly, there is global. So here, as I'm playing separate notes, that LFO is still going sort of over the top of them. So that's a global LFO. So it's not tied to the voice, it's just it just gets going and it keeps going regardless of what the player is doing. Really important and useful for certain types of things. Then you've got per voice. Each synthesizer is going to name them differently. Hear how it's the same every time if we speed this guy up. And that has its uses as well. Which is quite a different feel from, come here. So the whole sound is doing this, whereas now, meaning that we've got lots going up and down all at once. There is no right or wrong, you need to match it to the piece and the performance. In this one, key sync means that it starts the same every time. In this case, I don't know whether it's well explained in the manual, but I think it starts at a random point in the cycle, each key press, which is why it sounds nice and rich and kind of confused in an elegant way, whereas this sounds kind of stilted and rigid. But you've got those three basic modes. One is that it's just across the whole synthesizer. So the whole instrument's sound is going to do this. You've got the per voice random, where it'll pick a new point in here in which to start for each voice, or to sync them so that, say, at the beginning of every key press, it will just start here. So, and they each have their purpose, understand how they work. And the other one that people are obsessed with is to lock to a particular tempo. And I'm not a fan of this. Well, that sounds cool on its own. In the piece, where everything is locked to tempo, you might think that you're making it perfect and right, but you're making it imperfect, because nothing works that way. You get an orchestra pit and you pick violins 1 and you ask them all to play exactly the same thing. If you go to each one of those fiddlers, you'll find that they're starting at slightly different times, they're playing at slightly different pitches, they start their vibrato at slightly different times, the vibrato rates are slightly different. There's always going to be that variation. So the problem with using beat sync is that it locks things in ways that are really unnatural. There can be good things about it, but using it as a lazy default, oh, this is the way to be right, means that you're not doing it right at all, because you need to find the feel. And if you've got things moving around each other, just as this creates a wonderfully rich feel, which you don't get with this or this. So don't fall for the everything should go to beat sync straight away. All right, that's our basics. Go away, practice these things. Just get a sense for what do my basic oscillators sound like. They're my basic timbres, my basic tones. What does my filter do? Let's just turn this guy down. And don't spend your time with the resonance up unduly. Yes, it sounds very cool in 303, but you're going to miss a lot. We're looking for subtlety. You need to learn to feel subtlety. Just doing what I'm doing at the moment. help you tremendously. You don't have to know how to play anything at all. Gives you a feel for, oh, this is how this feels. And if you're not enjoying doing that, move on. Don't be a synthesist. Then look at your envelopes, both for amplifier, as in the level of the sound, and for filter movement. And put them in a way that they sound good. Please do not just go, now I'm a synthesist. If every sound you make sounds like this, you're kind of not learning to broaden out. By all means, make some of these. Make some of these. Even drop your octave, make some of these. You're learning stuff as you do that, but make sure that you make a lot of these. With an MSEG, you've often got an overall time. Oh, one thing I'll also say is, you've got a maximum amount that anything can be. Maximum level, maximum amount of filter openness. So if we've got this way halfway open, and we set this to more than halfway, see how it just goes up and kind of holds. Now there are reasons to do that, but if you're setting this high and this high, then there's probably little sense in that, especially if you're doing this. I see filter shapes like this a lot of the time, and you're just like, what's the point of that? Because it's just open and it's being held open. If it's because you want that release, by all means, but it's clearly without thought. Try to avoid, if we look up here, you can see a lot of activity up here, and it sounds hard and greebly and harsh. Try to avoid that. We'll talk about that more in the next video. Keep your sounds a lot warmer. That way, if you really need harsh, then you can bring it in. Most of the time, I don't even use sustain, to be honest. But spend a lot of time creating moving sounds like this, and then work out how to use your LFOs to make them really move. I don't care what genre you're in, you can be in the wubbiest of steppiest of whatever. These sounds are still really important. That's where you get your feel from. If every sound is just like ice pick, ice pick, ice pick, then you've got no way of creating a feel or a vibe inside things. A march of the ice picks isn't actually a piece because it's not interesting. So really look at your slower, more nuanced sounds and how to get them working. And your basic LFO. I'm using just one of everything at the moment. And I'd encourage you to do the same. You'll also see that I have not turned on unison. We'll discuss that next time when we get to effects. For the moment, keep your effects off or absolutely minimal. Some sounds you can't get until you get into effects, but we just want to explore the basics that we've covered here. You want to spend hours doing this, and I keep going back to it. Even after 40 years, I go back and I go, this is beautiful. I do it because I want to, and it keeps me grounded. And that's beautiful. I would build a piece around this sound right now if I had it. I'd go, oh, that's really nice. What's a melody or a set of chords or something that's going to make this work nicely? And there we go, I'd start to have a piece. Okay, so that's your practice. Go out there and practice over and over, just using those basic parts, moving them around until you can get a variety of sounds that you like. If you want, by all means, save them off using whatever system you've got, but at the same time, probably don't, because you don't want to be like, oh, now I've got my core presets, I'm going to stop learning to synthesize. I can do these basic core things every single time, and I don't save presets off for myself. I have gone through and done them for sale and what have you, but the reality is I will just go, what feel do I want here, or what feel wants to come out of the stone, and then I make that sound again and again and again and again, and each time it comes out differently. And that means it suits the piece, or it defines the piece, rather than being that's the one sound that's the perfect, that's going to guarantee me Grammys, because that's a messed up approach. That's not art, that's just trying to clone somebody who's better than you and will always be better than you because they're the real deal, and you're just trying to chase their crumbs, and it's not going to get you anywhere other than probably laughed at. You need to work out how to define your sound, and that goes across every style, genre, whatever. All right, so get in there, practice. If you have specific questions, ask them down below. Also, again, I'd please remind you, support. Either hire me to do something, whether it's mixing or working with your synthesizer sounds or helping you develop a piece, whatever you think I can help you with, hire me, or pop over to my Ko-fi, and either pay me some money to cover the value that you've got, and $4 is not what you would expect to be paid an hour for specialist work, let me tell you, or purchase one of my devices or something, whatever works for you, but please be sure to return value. All right, get out there, practice, have fun, work out how to make a beautiful world more beautiful. Oh, I'm supposed to stop.